Welcome to the Frugalpreneur podcast. I am Sarah St. John, and today's episode is going to be a little bit different. This episode marks the 100th episode of the Frugalpreneur show. So I thought I would go over why I started the podcast to begin with, how it's pivoted and evolved over time, the successes and failures that I have learned, as well as the future of the show. And then at the end, I'm going to have a giveaway. So please stay tuned and stick around for that. First things first, why I started the podcast. So the idea for the podcast actually originally sprouted out of a book that I wrote, also called Frugalpreneur, How to Launch, Manage, and Market an Online Business for Under $100 a Month. And it was while I was writing that book that I got the idea to start a podcast, also called Frugalpreneur, to coincide with the book as an extra marketing avenue. The plan was for the podcast to just be about 10 or so episodes. I was interviewing CEOs or people within the companies of some of the software programs I recommended in the book and things of that nature, but I was getting more leverage and traction from the podcast than the book. Plus, I love the networking and connections I was making, so I kept the podcast going. Now it's over 2 years and 100 episodes later. So I wanted to talk about the original idea for the podcast and how it's changed slightly, things I've learned, both good and bad, and so on. When I started the podcast in 2019, I was interviewing CEOs or people that work within the software companies that I used and recommended, as well as entrepreneurs I look up to and admire or follow. Then in 2020, I interviewed entrepreneurs who started a business with under $1,000 and built it over to $1 million without any outside investment, capital, loans, credit, debt, and so on. And of course, I've still had a variety of podcasts. They haven't just been about that. I've actually kind of found it difficult to find people who started a business with less than 1,000 and built it to over $1 million without any kind of capital and whatnot. If you or someone you know fits that category, let me know, and love to have you on the show. The year coming up, what you can look forward to, I'm going to actually do more solo episodes, kind of like this, just going over certain things I've learned, tips, tricks, advice, whether it be a particular software program that is affordable or free that I recommend, just a variety of different solo episodes. And then, of course, I'm also going to have more interviews with entrepreneurs, perhaps some coaching calls, and I have plans for a few different mini series within the podcast, one of which will be about the Shark Tank contestants. I'll have some of them on. Kid entrepreneurs. So if you have a kid or know someone who does, who is an entrepreneur, let me know. And then another thing I want to do is unconventional, creative ways to make money. So that's kind of how the show started, how it evolved, and where it's going in the future. I hope that sounds interesting. And if you have any other ideas, feel free to let me know. I'm open to hearing other suggestions and ideas for the show. Some successes from the show. I've made a lot of great friends and connections, perhaps potential joint venture partners in the future. I hope to meet a lot of these people at future conferences in 2022, but I did have the opportunity to meet one person in person, a person that I had interviewed on my show who lives in New York, and I happen to be in New York over Memorial Day weekend. So we got to meet up and have dinner, and that was awesome. And so, yeah, just friends and connections. And I didn't really know or think that was going to be something that came out of podcasting, but it's definitely a pleasant surprise. Another thing is that I've learned a lot because podcasting is sort of like a free one-on-one consultation. When I have people on, I learn something. And these even might be people that charge hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars an hour, or don't even offer the ability to have a one-on-one consultation. So that's an awesome experience as well. Let's see other things. Now, I've gotten to interview some of my entrepreneurial heroes, such as Pat Flynn, Mike Michalowicz, Christy Wright, who's a Dave Ramsey personality, Nick Loper, and others. And I look forward to interviewing more of these entrepreneurial heroes next year. I've managed to maintain a 5-star rating. I really appreciate anyone and everyone who has given me a rating and review. It's much appreciated. And if you've enjoyed this show and gotten anything out of it, I'd love to hear from you via a rating and review. Let's see. I have launched podcastresourcedirectory.com. It was one of the first podcast resource directories. There are definitely more now, but that's kind of taken a back seat for a little while because of other ventures that I will get into. But hopefully in 2022, that will get more populated with different podcast-related products, software, resources, and so on. Perhaps some of the biggest news is that I have launched a new agency called Podseam. That's PODSEAM.com. And that is my podcast production agency. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So I went from the podcast just being kind of a complementary with the book, and then it turned into now I have my own podcast production agency. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of came full circle for me. Okay, so now probably what you want to hear more about than the successes are the failures. So there was a several month period where I became what I'll call interview happy and did multiple recordings a week because I had the extra time because of COVID and quarantine, all of these things. And I just was banging out a lot of interviews. So currently I'm backlogged at least 40 or so episodes, which is not, I mean, you don't want to be in a position where you only have one episode available or none. At least I have plenty to last several weeks, but you still don't want that many because guests start to get a little impatient and wondering where their episode is, rightfully so. So what am I going to do to fix that? And what did I learn from that? Well, I learned that you shouldn't take on more than you can reasonably handle in an appropriate amount of time. And the steps that I will be taking to combat this in the future are, currently I will be releasing multiple episodes a week starting after this episode. So probably at least 3 a week so that I can get all the episodes out before the end of the year. Also, I have stopped doing interviews for the remainder of the year and will just be recording 1 episode a week starting in January so that guests don't have to wait weeks for their episode to be released. It's good to get ahead and batch and everything, but I think I took it a little too far. But, you know, you live, you learn, you move on, and that's what I'm doing. So I thought I would read I've never done this before, and I'm planning to start doing this anytime I get a new 5-star review. Plan to start reading some of those. So if you want your podcast review featured, or if you want a shout out on this show, then if you leave me a 5-star rating and review, I will read that on the air. Okay, so here's one from Galen Russ. This podcast helps me keep a pulse. I am thoroughly enjoying the Frugalpreneur podcast. I find it especially useful for helping me keep a pulse on what technology, software, and services are available out there to keep me current at an incredibly affordable, oftentimes free rate. As a nonprofit executive director, I constantly battle a finite budget, but still feel the pressure to stay up to date with the changing technologies. Frugalpreneur is quickly becoming my go-to podcast for staying in the know. Well, thank you so much, Galen Russ. Let's see. CJ Thomas 6 says, awesome show. Sarah and her guests always share helpful insights and advice. A definite must listen. Tommy WC says, awesome, helpful, and informative. Sarah and her guests are very knowledgeable. IV Ali H says, great podcast. Excellent content from this podcast. Really valuable insights from Sarah and her guests. Highly recommend. Flav Beats says, amazing podcast content. Love to listen to the latest episode on Facebook lead generation. These are steps I take on with my listeners on We Don't Play podcast, and I look forward to connecting with you. Great content, Sarah. CMF Son Eat It said, great info. Definitely a must listen for tips for business. Susan Neal Yoga said, excellent business tips. This podcast provides great tips for making money from your business on a shoestring budget. Thanks for all the wonderful free information. Prof. Dr. T says, I love this fast-paced interview. Provides a ton of information in a brief period of time. Keeps your concentration because of the fast pace. There is no time for your mind to wander. I'm a busy man and can't waste any time, so this was perfect for me. Great job. Can't wait to hear your next podcast. aka The Alchemist, wrote, "Glad to be a guest on the Frugalpreneur podcast and have the opportunity to be interviewed by a wonderful host, Sarah St. John. It has been a pleasure to share to your audience the alchemy formula and some of my business experience. Keep the great content going." Karen Briscoe says, "Achieve a higher level of success by tuning into Frugalpreneur with Sarah St. John and guests. Insights and inspiration that transform business and lives." S. Prita says, "Energizing host with great insights. Sarah is a great host, asking deep questions and creating an energizing atmosphere. I highly recommend her." Patrick Heggie says, "Sarah is a master. Just recently recorded an episode with Sarah, and it was such a joyous experience. Her ability to engage in knowledgeable conversation and maintain the flow of an episode is unparalleled. So far in my journey as a podcast guest, Frugalpreneur has without doubt been my favorite appearance. 10 out of 10 would recommend." White Knight 007 says, "Sarah is a great podcast host. Just recorded a podcast with Sarah and it was a blast. She is very fun, knowledgeable, and interesting to talk with. Highly recommend. Thanks, Sarah." In closing, I wanted to touch on something I had briefly mentioned earlier, my new podcast production agency, Podseam. I know a lot of people have asked, "I love listening to your show, but how can you help me?" And so if you need help launching or managing your podcast, please check out my agency, podseam.com. We do full podcast editing and post-production, including show notes, transcripts, audiograms, captions, social media videos, graphics, and more. In addition, we can help you with podcast strategy, guest management, podcast ads. If this interests you, please go to podseam.com and click on Book a Free Discovery Call. Or if you just want to do a one-time podcast audit, I'm offering them for just $97 for a limited time. In the audit, I go over your cover art, podcast name, podcast episode titles, your intro and outro, format, sound quality, production value, length, flow, on-air performance, calls to action, podcast directory discovery, podcast website, show notes, social media presence, and your rankings and reviews. To learn more, go to podseam.com/podcast audit. Again, that's podseam.com/podcast audit. Okay, now, last but not least, I am giving away the physical copy of my 3 books, Frugalpreneur, Authorpreneur, and Podcastpreneur. Enter the giveaway at thesarahstjohn.com/giveaway. That's TheSarahStJohn.com/giveaway. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this solo episode. Let me know what you thought of it and if you'd like more episodes like this one.